So the book that I chose to review for the course Church History 2 here at Spurgeon College was The Soul Winner. This was written, initially preached by Charles Spurgeon. It's actually a collection of sermons. The biggest indicator to when he preached these sermons that I could find is one of the sermons references that the year was 1887, although the prefatory note found in this book does indicate that this work was published posthumously in 1895. Some of the historical context for this book to consider whenever reading it is that Spurgeon was preaching at a time, as we've been learning in class, that rationalism, reason, and science were definitely on the move as far as inducing a school of thought where people were much more focused on rationality as opposed to religious ideology. As such, whenever you read this book, you can definitely feel the passion that Spurgeon has for soul winning in the face of this scientific opposition or philosophical opposition. For the context of the book, it's actually divided into 3 categories. The first 6 chapters are addresses to preachers that were attending a college specifically for the purpose of going on to lead congregations. Following that were 4 addresses to Sunday school teachers, open air preachers, as well as people that would have been part of Spurgeon's Monday evening prayer meetings. And then the final 6 chapters were just basically addresses to believers in general, so sermons that would have been preached at his church. The main argument in this book can be pretty well summed up in one quote, and that is that soul winning is the chief business of the Christian minister. So throughout this book, you can tell that Spurgeon's main goal in speaking these words is to ignite passion within the hearer, so that they aren't just receiving the message, but that they are grabbing on to some kind of application that they can then take with them, so that they can go be ministers, so that they can go win these souls. You can see throughout the book that there are several different emphases. I don't think one could accuse Spurgeon of neglecting certain aspects of soul winning. He repeatedly strongly emphasizes the idea of prayer when it comes to evangelizing others. He repeatedly emphasizes the empowerment of the Spirit. So while he's offering practical advice, it is almost always coupled with a strong sense that one needs to be united to the Spirit, and it's not something that we can do on our own as far as conversion or evangelism. But in that same token, he does place a strong emphasis on personal responsibility and preparation. So it is not the idea of Spurgeon that individuals can just sit and receive and rely on others to do the evangelism. As I stated earlier, he wants the hearer to be passionate about their own role in this business of soul winning. As far as difficulties or problems within the book, I honestly didn't spot many. I mean, he's the Prince of Preachers, so it's hard for me to give some kind of critique to his work. But some of the things that I thought another person might find is there's use of outdated language when he's speaking of other ethnicities or anything like that, and it's never used in a strictly derogatory sense. I think it's much more just the cultural acceptable terminology, but it's something that we likely wouldn't use today. Along with that, he does often employ a frank or a blunt discussion of certain groups of people. So whenever he's instructing how to win the souls of the poor or rural communities, some of the ways that he talks about these communities could be seen as offensive. Again, when I read it, I didn't feel that kind of hatefulness or anything like that. I didn't read any intended offense, but he does talk about the fact that people are uneducated and how it is that we can reach uneducated groups, or the fact that people aren't concerned with certain things, or people are unemployed. Like, he definitely is just aware of reality and is not afraid to address that reality, potentially at the expense of hurting someone. But again, I don't ever think that that's his intention, and I don't read it that way. But trying to look from an objective standpoint, I could see how someone could misconstrue some of that discussion. Likewise, I feel like I've strongly stated that he doesn't promote an over-reliance on self, but it would be easy to cherry pick some of his arguments and try to promote the idea that he had an over-reliance on self, especially in his addresses to the college, to people that specifically were going to become preachers. He's very straightforward and direct, and there's a section in there on grammar, like things that we could, oh, that's legalistic, or oh, that's, trying to align oneself with an elevated view of humanity instead of allowing the Spirit to speak freely. I think people can misconstrue some of that, but I don't get that from my own reading. And I do think that you have to read all of those things in context. So he wants people to care about their grammar when speaking to others, because it can be a distraction from the gospel. And so always keeping that tension and holding on to it, and coupling those issues of self-awareness along with issues of not quenching the Spirit, which I think is the reality of the Christian call. We can't be a bull in a china shop. We have to be able to recognize how we're going to be received, or how one is going to hear us, and our gospel presentation reflects that. And he honestly really consistently calls back to the passage where Paul says that to the Jews he became a Jew, and to the Gentiles he became as a Gentile. It seems, at least in this collection of sermons, that is a very guiding passage for Spurgeon's main conceit. We don't speak over eloquently if we're not talking to educated masses. His goal is for that those who hear would take the gospel in its simplicity, don't overdress it, don't undersell it, but present the gospel solely, explicitly to those around you for the purpose of winning souls. Talking about the significance that the hearers initially would have felt, and those of us today reading it hundreds of years later can draw on. It's significant, I think, because it provides an extremely clear call to action, coupled with an abundance of practical advice. He's not overly spiritual, and I don't mean that in a Christian sense. I mean that in a metaphysical sense. He's not asking you to do anything outside the bounds of what the average person is capable of doing. He just wants people to be aware that the greatest call is the winning of souls. He is very apt to break all of that down. There are several sections where he talks about what it means to win. And he even talks about what is a soul? How is it different from the spirit? How is it different from the body? It's extremely accessible. I was kind of surprised by that. I really was not looking forward to this assignment, mainly because I struggle with Old English, and I thought this is going to be such a chore, and it's going to be so difficult to understand. But the exact opposite was true. It was very readable, very understandable. That's not to say it wasn't heavy. There were definitely times where I read something and I'd have to sit and process before I moved on to the next passage. But the fact that I was able to take that information and synthesize it while I was doing the reading and not as a secondary action, I think speaks to just how well written, well spoken, I guess, these messages were. I think another important aspect of Spurgeon's message is the universality of his call to soul winning. None of it is exclusionary. So even though he's speaking to preachers, a lot of those same principles that are present in the first 6 chapters make a reappearance in the later chapters as well. Something that I also thought was very interesting was that in his addresses to Sunday school teachers, he urges them to take very seriously the act of soul winning children. And so for us to read something spoken by a preacher that was then delivered to preachers, it's easy for me to think, well, I'm not going to be a preacher, so I don't know how this applies to me, or I'm not sure how to put this into practical action. But the call of soul winning, according to Charles Spurgeon, applies to all, regardless of who the audience is, regardless of what your platform is. The gospel needs to be shared. The gospel must be acted upon, and we almost must demand a response of those listening to us. It's very interesting to see how desperately he wants people to answer the call of Christ. It goes beyond just the idea of presenting the gospel and then sitting back and waiting. I mean, he wants you to present it confidently. He wants you to go in thinking someone is going to come to Christ, and that should inform your entire gospel presentation, which I think is not something that we necessarily, I don't want to say believe in today, but not necessarily the way that we enter in some of those situations today. Overall, I really enjoyed reading this a lot more than I thought I would, like I said. Again, I think it's very accessible. I think almost anyone could read it. And I was just really pleasantly surprised. There was a lot of humor, which I was not expecting. There was a lot of practical application. And there was a lot that I wanted to discuss. I mean, I highlighted and underlined things, and my poor husband had to listen to me talk about some of the plays on words that Spurgeon makes, that sort of thing. I would definitely recommend this book, especially to the mature believer, or one who is struggling in their application of the Great Commission. I think this really helps the believer to kind of synthesize the reality of that call